Be it you, your family, your organization, or the world, leadership is critical to your success. Yet, this is an area hugely misunderstood, misinterpreted, and abused by many organizations and leaders. Today, our discussion is about the buzzword leadership. For today's discussion, I have invited, I call him a humble leader, to share his wisdom with us. He is a leadership trainer, TEDx speaker, and a clever author. Please welcome the speaker for the day is Vidusha Nathavitharana. Welcome to the show, Vidusha.
Thank you. Great to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
It's always a pleasure to invite you. You were in my list for a longer time, but I thought this is the right time for me to send out that invitation. If someone watching us wants to know who Vidusha Nathavitharana is, how could you describe yourself?
The bulk of the work I do is about helping people to find out who they really are and fulfill their potential. I think that's the closest I can get in 10 words. It's about, I hate the word trainer. I try to use the word a facilitator of learning, because I think learning is far more important, and training is a very, very small component of that. So I think for today's discussion, that would suffice. I'll get into it later on once you ask your questions.
Excellent, excellent. Love your concise answer. As you just rightly mentioned, one thing that I learned throughout my facilitation or training, so-called training career, is that letting people understand what they need to understand is an art than a science, right? So it has definitely science involved, but it's how well you let them experience what they need to learn. That's where the learning happens. It's a discovery than just teaching. Vidusha, I want to start the discussion by looking at the definition of leadership, because what I realize is this: although this has been a buzzword, this is kind of the word that every organization has to utter at one point of time, many days, many times in a given day. One thing that I feel is that we tend to misunderstand and misinterpret the term leadership. To get a start to this talk, can you define leadership? What is leadership for you?
Okay, that's a fantastic place to start, Niroshan, because I think I think you're right. The issue is that we do tend to look at leadership and leaders thereof in very different ways, and interpretations and definitions are important because that gives you a framework to work within, isn't it? So if you get your definition wrong, I think everything else that happens afterwards is wrong. So even in academia, defining something is the starting point of any research paper that you do, isn't it? That's always the start. So, okay. The issue is that there are very, very, very many into leadership. And picking one is very, very difficult, and I try not to also. However, given that you told me to define it, let me try and interpret it the way I see it, right? Rather than from a textbook definition perspective. So the leadership definition that I found most interesting and probably the most practical for the kind of work we do from an organizational perspective is that leadership is a process. Okay. So if you ask what leadership is, most people turn around and say it's a person who drives an organization or a group of people towards a common objective. Now, the moment you say it's a person, you start fixating on one. And that's always the primary issue, right? But the moment you utilize the word process, right, that leadership is a process. Remember that leadership is a verb, right? It's not a noun. So the moment it's a verb, it has to be doing something. And what is it doing? So leadership is about, guiding or facilitating a group of people towards meeting a common objective. The rest of the sentence is fine. But the moment you say leadership is a person who drives or facilitates an organization towards a common objective versus leadership is a process that drives an organization towards a common objective. The two of them makes a stark difference in how you view leadership. Now, the moment you say leadership is a process, by definition itself, whoever is involved in that process, in whatever way, in whichever small contribution they make, by definition itself is a leader. And I think that's what organizations need to understand. So the moment we change that definition, everything flips, right? So imagine if we turn around and say, in any organization, leadership is a process, be involved in that process. So whatever you're doing as an organization, the moment someone's involved in it, by definition itself, you become a leader, and that empowers you. You don't need someone to give you authority at that point. All you need is your involvement and your appreciation of what is taking place. So I think that, to me, makes a huge difference, and it makes all the difference in the world, especially if you're teaching leadership, because that makes every one of us an equal contributor in many ways towards that. So I think that to me is my definition of it. Leadership is a process, and anyone who's involved in that process of ensuring that the organization meets its objectives, whatever the objectives might be, is a leader.
Excellent. I love that. I love that. And I'm just adding this, Vidusha. What triggered me to consider this particular topic for a live talk, is the fact that, of course, it's not a straight line, where we all go through happy times, frustrations, disappointments, whatsoever. So in my journey, one thing I realize is that it's not just about managing people for me, right? As you rightly stated, it's a process for me. What it, how I interpret, or how, my addition to that statement would be, Vidusha, it's managing the system around people. What is your thinking around that? So this is also coming from a trending management mindset called Management 3.0. Anyone who is watching us, just search for this term, Management 3.0. So this is mainly for the agile teams, but it is valid for any organization, any team, right? And I'm a practitioner of that particular mindset and framework. What is believed is that leadership is managing the system around the people, not just the people itself, right? I think where the organizations go wrong is there, right? We think management is about controlling the people around us, right, in our organization. So we put a lot of procedures, we put a lot of guidelines, we put a lot of rules, we give everything that they need. Kind of, we don't understand the management is just facilitating the environment that they need to have.
Let me quietly kind of add a few subtleties into that, right? There is a very real danger in using the word management if you don't quite interpret it right, because there are positive and negative connotations in all of this, right? So imagine this, right? When you talk about systems around people or people around systems, which comes first is the big question. That's number one, right? So, correct. And the other thing is, can you manage it in the first place, or should you manage it? Okay. And I'm not going to get into the discussion of it, because I know it's not the thrust of what you want to discuss today, but let me just add this, right? Think of it as an ecosystem. Okay. Think of anything like an ecosystem. And the best example I can give you for an ecosystem is a fish tank, right? So if the fish tank has been set up in a manner, I mean, most people have ornamental fish at some point, and my son just went and got some fish in the morning today. So, it's top of mind for me. So let me give you an example through that, right? So if you set up your fish tank with aerators and, filters and all the rest of it, and have a type of fish that requires a huge amount of effort to keep, versus if you take a look at a river, is also an ecosystem, but it's self-managing, right? So fish tanks is what we try and do inside organization. We create artificial systems with the hope that whoever that is occupying that space thrives. We don't look at it from an organic perspective. Okay. Whereas you don't need to do anything to the river. Of course, unless you went and cut down all the trees like we do around it, right? And dredge it and build dams around it, then of course, yes. Then the whole thing goes to the six. But in its natural setting, you really don't need to do anything to it. The entire species thrives. Now, that is, I think, where you need to draw inspiration from trying to force certain things by looking at something and saying, you know what, let's come in. And this is where I disagree and vehemently oppose, things like best practices, because to me, there aren't anything called best practices, right? What we need to be creating are self-sustaining ecosystems that suits us. And each individual organization needs to soul search and find that for themselves. And it's a bit of a journey. It's not really a destination. But when you find it, the good news is you don't need to tinker with it at all. All you need to do is to just let it be, and it will thrive. And ever so often, you might want to put in a few things here and there just to make sure that the aesthetics of it is nicer. But the fundamental activity self-propels itself. I think that is the holy grail. So when we talk about management, I mean, from a broader perspective, right, the entire cosmos is managed, right, by universal laws. That there is order to it. Otherwise, we won't exist, right? Imagine there'll be complete chaos, but there's order. So in that sense, but it is self-managed. Nobody's tinkering with it. It tinkers with itself. The checks and balances are inbuilt. That's what organizations need to do. We need to build ecosystems that self-sustains itself and also makes sure that every single person who's occupying that space has an opportunity to truly become the best versions of themselves. You do that and let people be. I think most human beings are capable of self-management. It's just that we don't necessarily manage the way somebody else wants us to. Let me give you a simple example for that, right? So my son and daughter are complete polar opposites.
Right.
Okay. Having been born from the same mother and father. Right. My daughter is a very structured, organized. My son turns around and terms her OCD, which is probably true. But she's a very, very structured person, right? She goes around things in a very, very systematic manner. My son, on the other hand, is the kind of person who wakes up in the morning and then decides what he needs to do, right? Now, he has certain objectives in his mind, but the way he goes about in a complete loose cannon kind of perspective. And we try and tell one of them to adjust how they do things in accordance with what we think is right. I think that's the starting point of all disasters. However, if you can teach my daughter to work on the fly a little bit, at the same time, if you can teach my son a little bit of focus, both of them flourish. But their trigger point and the way they kind of move things fundamentally might be different. But they both know how to do both. That's where we need to be. So the issue is not so much whether we manage the systems around people or the people manage the systems or whatever we play. The fundamental principle you need to understand and have in your head is that the least amount of tinkering we do with it and allow people to kind of organically figure these things out and give that space, I think that's when leadership comes in the most important. And that's what leaders ought to be doing in the first place, allowing the person to find that way. And of course, remember this, right? We are working in organizations. We are not working, in limbo, in absolute nothingness, right? So we have to work with other people. That is when the issue happens. If you're doing something your way, I'm doing something my way, somebody else is doing it some other way. How do you bring all of it together? That is your leadership role coming in. You try and manage that. It's very difficult. One or two things will take place. One is that either some people will be completely disgruntled and leave, or you have to keep tinkering with it all the time, which is exhausting, and it doesn't work out in the first place in the long term. So that, I think, is the crux of leadership.
Now, the next aspect that I would like to touch base on is the competencies. Now, whatever said and done, though, as you said, right, the organizations have their strategic goals. They spend a lot of money, energy. Therefore, they want the ROI. Correct. So if I have to become a manager of such organization, sometimes I have to forget the right way of doing it. Sometimes I have to challenge the systems. My observation is this, right? The moment from the time I started managing responsibilities, right? When I became a lead, then got promoted to a manager, then a senior manager, then at the moment I'm doing coaching, right? Half my time is filled with coaching organizations to adopt the right practices, right? Concepts, strategies, plus work with the people, and of course the deliverables. Now in this thing, I realize that there are very critical personal traits, personal competencies that we need to get in us. Say, I'm a production staff trying to be a manager, trying to be a leader. So what are the top three competencies that I may focus on?
Okay. So, great question and a great place to start. I think here's the trick. Before I answer the question itself, let me give you a quick context to that. Okay. The thing is that most people, like you said, try to be a leader, and that's something that we are taught to do, isn't it? From the very inception, especially when you take on more senior roles. We are told now you're not an individual contributor anymore, you're a team lead or you're a manager, and therefore you have to now start focusing on leadership. And we are, in our heads, we are saying, okay, we are somewhere here, so there's a gap, and we need to bridge that gap. And I think, honestly, this is counterproductive. Okay, I understand the difference between an individual contributor and a team lead, and of course a manager and a senior manager. I understand that context, but the way we process that should be slightly different. Okay, because I honestly think the moment you differentiate leadership and make it something that you do on top of your job, that becomes a problem. Because that's when everybody starts resisting this. That's why we send people for leadership training as well, right? Now there's a gap, so let me send you for some leadership training, and therefore you'll come back as a leader. All nonsense as far as I'm concerned, right? Because we can't do it that way. So the issue is this, right? The issue is there are two concepts that are interplaying here. One is that of, and you picked up on this very, very well, which is, one side of it is you need to deliver results. The other side of it is that you need to make sure that you coach and guide and grow people. And most people think of these two things as two different things. That's the problem. They are not two different things, right? They're one and the same. It's a bit like, so I'm going to digress here and I'll come back to it, right? Sure. It's exactly the same what we do as parents, right? Now, what do you want your child to achieve? Do you want them to get 90 marks? And the answer would be yes. I mean, most parents would, especially from our part of the world, going to school and getting good marks is a big deal, right? So we would like to think that they come back with an A report, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that objective. However, if your focus is on the 90 marks, you lose out on the principle of actually knowing your subject, because there are many ways of getting 90 marks. So the way we set the objective is critical. So if we focus on the 90 marks and tell the fellow cram and get 90 marks, maybe he'll study for 2 days if he's really bright and get 90 marks. Ask him 1 week later what happened, he won't remember a thing. Then what's the point in the 90 mark? The 90 mark doesn't mean anything, right? So when we set objectives as an organization and when we tell our leadership that you need to achieve this objective, you have to understand how you go about doing this. Can be two very broad categories of doing things, right? One is at the cost of people. One is with people. You can achieve objectives at the cost of people too. Now, if we as a culture of an organization haven't really defined that and made both of them the same, that when we meet objectives, that we mean meeting it with people and not at the cost of people. If we haven't done that as an organization, then it's our fault. Okay, so the starting point of this, when I'm talking about competencies, I'm starting with the viewpoint that organizations should have and must define objectives in a manner that everyone understands that meeting objectives is not at the cost of people. Okay, that's critically important. So in that context, if you want to meet objectives as a collective, if you want to meet objectives as a group of people, and if you want to meet objectives not at the cost of people but through people, with people, then three critical competencies come in, and they're not textbook definitions, unfortunately, right? So you mentioned also trait and competency. I think that's an important distinction to make as well, right? Now, a trait is something that is inbuilt into you. It's one of your characteristics. However, a behavior might or might not be consistent or congruent with your thinking pattern, right? So sometimes we elicit behaviors which are completely different to how we think, because we want to adapt or be okay in a certain context. So I'm not going to get into all of that. But three behaviors, let's put it from that, right? Three behaviors we need to kind of demonstrate.
Right.
And I always talk about this in every single one of my training sessions, right? And I say, start here. You really want to take on leadership position, start here. The first is love. Right. And I bring it back to parenting, because I think that's the closest that you and I and most people can relate to. Even if you're not a parent right now, you would have had parents. And I'm not saying all parents are great parents. I'm just saying that by and large, most people would have had decent parents, right? So there's a reference point. So if you take a look at good parenting and good leadership, I think they're both exactly the same. The first principle that you need to understand, and the three behaviors will come from that principle. The only principle you need to understand if you want to be a leader is that it's not about you. Get that out of your head. This is not about you.
Okay.
This is about the organization. This is about the people that you're working with. This is about them. This is not about you. If you think it's about you, you lost the plot. So and when you bring up children, you're not trying to kind of do something that is best for you. You're not on an ego trip for yourself as a parent. You're honestly trying to do what is best for the child. Now, the way you go about it might be different, and you might fail horribly in it, but the underlying ethos is that, right? So the three things I think great parents have is, the first is love. You really need to love your child. Correct? No, you can't kind of turn around and not love your child, right? Where is that going to go? I mean, I hate you, but nevertheless, I'm a good parent. It doesn't work that way. You need to really love your child, right?
Yeah.
So your team is the same. Your job is the same. Your organization is the same. And everyone you're working. Now, love is a strong term, and I mean that purposefully, right? And we'd have different elements of love, right? The way you love your son might be slightly different to the way you love your daughter. The way you love your daughter might be slightly different to the way you love your wife. The way you love your wife might be different to the way you love your mother. But but the bottom line is, you love all of them, right? The way you love them might be different, but you love all of them. Similarly, you need to love your team, and everyone included in it, right? If you don't, you have a problem. You can't start a leadership journey by hating people, right? Oh, I don't like that fellow. He's he's no good. His attitude is bad, and all that nonsense. You can't, right? So the first principle is love. You need to love your team, and love the job you do as well, right? One and the same. They both go hand in hand. The second is, you need to be absolutely responsible for everything that they do. Right, I view your posts with a smile on my face, because that's why I'm smiling. Right, I remember you with your daughter giving little talks and podcasts and things like that from the back of your car, and you get her involved in all of this. Now, if she got really bad marks and got called into school, you're responsible for her, right? At that point, you have to take full and complete accountability for the fact that she has not really done well. Okay. And defend her at that point, and make sure that Now, you can also take the attitude. Look, what can I do? I send you to school. I tell you to study. I give you tuition. The rest is up to you. I don't care. You can take on that attitude as well, and I think right. But the point is, with anybody else, having a conversation is different. But if you seriously are trying to be a good parent, you're responsible for that child. Completely and utterly, until the day you die. It's not something that finishes off when you're 18. You're responsible. Now, the level of responsibility changes. At 25, you're not going to treat your daughter the same way you treat her now. That's different. But you're responsible nevertheless. If something goes wrong, you're still responsible, accountable. And you need to have that conviction inside you for that. The third is, I think, the most critical part. And that's what defines good leaders from great leaders, right? Which is sacrifice. You will always put them first. You will always put them first. Their interests come first. Their problems come first. Their needs come first. You come last in that equation. Now, the issue is, in organizations, when we become leaders, when was the last time we sacrificed something of ourselves on their best interest? When was the last time I sacrificed my bonus to make sure that they got a bonus? When was the last time I sacrificed my free time to make sure they went home on time? When was the last time that I made sure that I was inconvenienced for them? That is the crux. And this is where most people flounder. Because taking love is okay, because as long as you have a great team and you're doing well, you're fine. Taking responsibility is also fine. Ultimately, I am responsible for the results of the organization, right? So there's nothing I can do to dodge it. It's there. Sacrifice, though, the moment you use that word, people flinch. And that, to me, is the pivotal point of it. What will you sacrifice on behalf of your team? The day you show that, I think you transcend all borders, you transcend all titles, you transcend all the organizational structures, and people will see you as a leader. So you want to make sure that you take on a leadership journey, because it's not a destination to begin with. You need to make sure that you understand that they come first, and they're what you're there for, not about you. That has to be your underlying ethos. You need to love your team. You need to love what you do. You need to make sure that you take total and absolute accountability and responsibility. And you need to make sure that you sacrifice on their behalf. If you can do that, well, I think you've already become a leader. It's that simple.
Excellent insights, Vidusha. Love your insights. Because I already knew that your wisdom around this term is huge. That's exactly why you are here, right? So thanks for sharing your knowledge. I also, I think you acknowledge that it's not an easy journey, right? Whatever we say here, just living what we say here is not gonna be the easiest job. It's really challenging. But I think every organization has to think just like a parent. That's what we are saying here, right? So if you have those three behaviors demonstrated for your teams, your people, I think you will be seen as a great leader. And that's what we see from servant leaders, like, from the history, right? So, if you look at Mother Teresa, she wasn't given any authority, right? She wasn't thinking about her first place, right? So she represented people, right? That's where we tend to see such people as leaders, right? That's why, I would, my father is not so educated, but for me, I think that's the best leader. He's the best leader that I've ever met in my life, right? So that's because I think those qualities, those behaviors demonstrated over the years, right? And realizing that without eating, I remember this, Vidusha, very well, right? Because I come from a kind of underprivileged, it's not exactly underprivileged, but, we had a lot of challenges in our small days. But I remember, right, my father going to hard work, labor, kind of labor work, coming back, with food. So I remember scenes, because I then I realized, okay, my father is sacrificing his time, his energy, his entire life to feed us, right? Educate us. My education wasn't so easy, right? I remember very well when I wanted to do the first diploma, that was 40,000 rupees by then. I went to my father and I said, my father, dear father, I want 40,000. I did not realize how difficult it was for him, but that would have been the biggest challenge for him, right? But he did it. Sure. That's the reason why I'm here. And but for me, when I think of my father, I have a lot of respect, right? I see him as the greatest leader. I think this is what we need to achieve as leaders in organizations, right?
Can I just drop a small note then? And I think that's probably I mean, you resonate with this. What I'm saying is because probably you and I come from pretty much the same backgrounds, right? I grew up very much the same. My dad was the first in his family to come to Colombo. He was the first to get education in a formal sense. Most of his family, he comes from a family of 11, and most of his family never left the village that they grew up in, right? And I think what you need to understand is this: you can't fake this. Right? You can't fake this. If you're trying to be a leader and you're trying to demonstrate these behaviors, and this is the problem that we have now, right? We've been taught to try and get these things going. We can't try this. This must be genuinely you. You can't try and love your children. You can't try and take responsibility. You can't try and make sacrifices. You can do that in the short term. You can put on a show. You can fake it, right, for a small period of time. But the moment you falter because you're not genuine, that is the biggest mistake that leaders make. You're far better off being honest and not being any one of these. Honestly, right? So don't fake it. That's really important. You need to be genuine in this endeavor. Leadership, first and foremost, is a genuine endeavor. You really, really can't, try and put on these things. These are not things that you learn by reading a book or anything like that. This is something that you need to internalize for yourself. It needs to come with emotion, right? So understand these things not from a logical perspective only. Understand this from a deeply psychological and emotional perspective also. You need to know this in the depths of your hearts and your souls. You can't, as I said, that's why I bring in parenting. I mean, the moment I talked about it, it touched a nerve with you, and that's because you looked at your dad. You didn't call your dad a leader. You just called him Tata. That's it, right? And the respect and the trust that you have is a lifetime of it. And you've seen this throughout your life, right? So how much of it do our teams see that in us on a daily basis? They see it the same way you're talking about your father, they will talk about you too.
Absolutely.
And that to me is just the principle of it. So forget the title leader or anything like that and just do that. Make sure that you genuinely support somebody to be at their best. Now imagine if your father thought to himself, මේක රුපියල් 40,000 ඉල්ලන පිස්සුද මන් දන්නේ බලවන් මට රුපියල් 1000 විතර හම්බෙන්නේ මාර කියලා ඔළුවට වඩා ඉදිරියට කාලකන්ණිය මුට මෙච්චර කරලා මදි
නැති දේවල් කරනවා
කොච්චර දේවල් කරත් මදි no you can have that reaction too, right? So you imagine if your father turns around and offends in you talking about $40,000 because you didn't understand the weight of the 40,000 and you wanted to educate yourself. Your father was able to empathize with that and say, hey, you know what? He wants to better himself and be somebody better than me. Fantastic. He supports you. No, that's the same principle we need to have as bosses, with whatever title you want to call them, managers, leaders, boss, whatever, right? If I can do that for you as my subordinate, as someone who's working with me, side by with me, for me, whatever. If you can do that to a fellow human being, forget everything else, right? If you can do that for a fellow human being, you imagine how wonderful that will be. You imagine how wonderful that will be. And the moment you do that, I think people respect you. And with respect and trust, everything else falls in place. The issue is we don't. We look at all the other fancy theories, we forget these three, I think.
Correct. Excellent. Thanks a lot, Vidusha. So we have a comment from Rumesh. Rumesh, thanks for your active involvement. We see that you're really listening to us, also contributing with your thoughts, right? So love, accountable, sacrifice, 3 great characteristics for a leader, and well explained indeed. Areas where people really struggle in terms of being leaders. So thanks a lot for your comment as well. So quick time check, 6:42, Vidusha. Time has just always it's just flying, right? So we have 20 minutes. In this 20 minutes, I want to jump into the practical aspect of it. So there are a lot of things that I would love to discuss with you, get your wisdom around those topics, but the time doesn't allow us to do that. So I straight away would like to jump into the next topic, that is the practical exposure of it, right? So my observation is this: there are a lot of management theories, models, concepts around us. We also utter them a lot. Organizations start adopting a lot of management frameworks,
Yes, charged.
but there is a missing link, right? How can we live these things practically, right? How can we apply these concepts practically? That's what we are going to discuss now. Now, my first question is, so just tell us few tips, right? Few tips how you could understand your people. Is
Great.
there any practice that you can recommend in terms of knowing your people well enough so that you can work with them, right? Because it's
Sure.
we now agree that it's about them, not about us as leaders.
Yep.
So how can we understand our people?
Right. So I'm going to give you a dead straight answer, which is dead simple. Don't
Okay.
shoot me for that. But I think the
Don't
easiest thing...
don't call me. Don't call me as well.
No. So seriously, because whenever I say these things, people laugh at me and saying, this is not exactly what I was expecting, right? But
Right.
genuinely, if you really want to know and understand your people, I think there's only one thing you need to do: genuinely ask,
Right.
rather than making assumptions.
Excellent insights, Vidusha. Love your insights. Because I already knew that your wisdom around this term is huge. That's exactly why you are here, right? So thanks for sharing your knowledge. I also I think you acknowledge that it's not an easy journey, right? Whatever we say here, just living what we say here is not going to be the easiest job. It's really challenging, but I think every organization has to think just like a parent. That's what we are saying here, right? So if you have those three behaviors demonstrated for your teams, your people, I think you will be seen as a great leader. And that's what we see from servant leaders. My father is not so educated. He's the best leader that I've ever met in my life. That's because I think those qualities, those behaviors demonstrated over the years. We had a lot of challenges in our small days, but I remember, right, my father going to hard work, labor, kind of labor work, coming back, with food. So I remember scenes, because I then I realized, okay, my father is sacrificing his time, his energy, his entire life to feed us, educate us. My education wasn't so easy. I remember very well when I wanted to do the first diploma, that was 40,000 rupees by then. I went to my father and I said, my father, dear father, I want 40,000. I did not realize how difficult it was for him, but that would have been the biggest challenge for him, right? But he did it. Sure. That's the reason why I'm here. And but for me, when I think of my father, I have a lot of respect. I see him as the greatest leader. I think this is what we need to achieve as leaders in organizations.
Can I just drop a small note then? And I think that's probably, you resonate with this. What I'm saying is because probably you and I come from pretty much the same backgrounds, right? I grew up very much the same. My dad was the first in his family to come to Colombo. He was the first to get education in a formal sense. Most of his family, he comes from a family of 11. And most of his family never left the village that they grew up in, right? And I think what you need to understand is this: you can't fake this, right? You can't fake this. If you're trying to be a leader and you're trying to demonstrate these behaviors, and this is the problem that we have now, right? We've been taught to try and get these things going. We can't try this. This must be genuinely you. You can't try and love your children. You can't try and take responsibility. You can't try and make sacrifices. You can do that in the short term. You can put on a show. You can fake it, right, for a small period of time. But the moment you falter because you're not genuine, that is the biggest mistake that leaders make. You're far better off being honest and not being any one of these. Honestly, right? So don't fake it. That's really important. You need to be genuine in this endeavor. Leadership, first and foremost, is a genuine endeavor. You really, really can't, try and put on these things. These are not things that you learn by reading a book or anything like that. This is something that you need to internalize for yourself. It needs to come with emotion, right? So understand these things not from a logical perspective only. Understand this from a deeply psychological and emotional perspective also. You need to know this in the depths of your hearts and your souls. You can't, as I said, that's why I bring in parenting. I mean, the moment I talked about it, it touched a nerve with you, and that's because you looked at your dad. You didn't call your dad a leader. You just called him Tata. That's it, right? And the respect and the trust that you have is a lifetime of it. And you've seen this throughout your life, right? So how much of it do our teams see that in us on a daily basis? They see it the same way you're talking about your father, they will talk about you too.
Absolutely.
And that to me is just the principle of it. So forget the title leader or anything like that and just do that. Make sure that you genuinely support somebody to be at their best. Now imagine if your father thought to himself, මේක රුපියල් 40,000 ඉල්ලන පිස්සුද මන් දන්නේ මේ බලවන් මට රුපියල් 1000 විතර හම්බෙන්නේ මාර කියලා. ඔළුවට වඩා ඉදිරියට කාලකන්ණිය මුට මෙච්චර කරලා මදි.
නැති දේවල් කරනවා.
කොච්චර දේවල් කරත් මදි. No, you can have that reaction too, right? So you imagine if your father turns around and offends in you talking about $40,000 because you didn't understand the weight of the 40,000 and you wanted to educate yourself. Your father was able to empathize with that and say, hey, you know what? He wants to better himself and be somebody better than me. Fantastic. He supports you. Oh, that's the same principle we need to have as bosses, with whatever title you want to call them, managers, leaders, boss, whatever, right? If I can do that for you as my subordinate, as someone who's working with me, side by with me, for me, whatever. If you can do that to a fellow human being, forget everything else, right? If you can do that for a fellow human being, you imagine how wonderful that will be. You imagine how wonderful that will be. And the moment you do that, I think people respect you. And with respect and trust, everything else falls in place. The issue is we don't. We look at all the other fancy theories, we forget these three, I think.
Correct. Excellent. Thanks a lot, Vidusha. So we have a comment from Rumesh. Rumesh, thanks for your active involvement. We see that you're really, listening to us, also contributing with your thoughts, right? So love, accountable, sacrifice, 3 great characteristics for a leader, and well explained indeed. Areas where people really struggle in terms of being leaders. So thanks a lot for your comment as well. So my observation is this. There are a lot of management theories, models, concepts around us. We also utter them a lot. Organizations start adopting a lot of management frameworks.
Yes, charged.
But there is a missing link, right? How can we live these things practically, right? How can we apply these concepts practically? That's what we are going to discuss now. Now, my first question is, so just tell us few tips, right? Few tips how you could understand your people. Is there, any practice that you can recommend in terms of knowing your people well enough so that you can work with them, right? Because it's we now agree that it's about them, not about us as leaders. Yep. So how can we understand our people?
Right. So I'm going to give you a dead straight answer, which is dead simple. Don't shoot me for that. But I think the easiest thing...
Don't call me. Don't call me as well.
No. So seriously, because whenever I say these things, people laugh at me and say, this is not exactly what I was expecting, right? But genuinely, if you really want to know, and understand your people, I think there's only one thing you need to do: genuinely ask.
Right.
Rather than making assumptions, just ask people, what are your aspirations? What do you like doing? Give you a classic example of this, right? If you simply went and asked somebody who's working with you for about 6 months to a year, what do you like about your job? What you don't like about your job? And I mean a genuine one-on-one conversation, right? Forget lengthy questionnaires and things like that. They will tell you, especially if they have trust for you. If they tell you, and if you do something about that, you have a fantastic starting point. So if you really ask people what they like, what they don't like, sometimes we can do things about what they don't like, sometimes we can't, and then we can have a dialogue around it at least and get people to understand that. But imagine if you've never had that conversation, we are on assumptions at that point. So you really want to understand your people, my advice to you is just go sit down, grab a cup of coffee somewhere and talk to them and ask them the genuine question: what is it that you're really looking for? What is it that you like? What is it that you don't like? And how can I help you in that? So if you ask those 3 simple questions from people, chances are you have a fantastic practical starting point, and it doesn't cost you anything.
Excellent. The most simplistic answer that I have ever imagined. Just like what you just told us about how to look at your son and daughter, and you kind of understand them, realize that they have different set of behaviors themselves, they are unique, etc. Right? Now, as a parent, you probably need to get them at their best. In other words, empower them to become a greater version themselves, right? You might not straight away say, hey, you have to be a doctor or someone. That's not empowering, that's commanding, right? Now, if we want our people to be empowered for what they want to become in terms of their definition of success, in terms of their criteria, right? Tell us few practical tips to tackle that, how to empower your people.
Right. So again, I'm going to get back to basics, right? A subtle difference here. I honestly have always argued, especially when I run programs, that empowerment isn't something that you give. Empowerment is something that you need to take, right? And let me clarify that statement. See, the issue is that we are all waiting for somebody to give empowerment.
Right.
Stop doing that to begin with, right? As an individual, okay? So as employees, whenever we have conversations with teams, we tell them, don't wait for your boss to have a conversation with you. Why don't you go have a conversation with them? Because as I said, I'm going to go back to my beginning, right? Leadership is a process. Everyone needs to be involved in this. You can't be the only man who's driving this. It doesn't work that way, okay? So imagine if empowerment was to be taken, what would you do? I would go and tell my boss, I want this. Now then you can tell me as my boss whether you can do this for me or not, or whatever, or how we can go about this, right? So imagine your son coming and telling you, I want a bike. Right? You don't go and ask your son, do you want a bike? No. Right. He comes and tells you, I want a bike. Right? Now then we can have a conversation around it. Turn around and say, all right, I can get you a bike. However, you need to make sure that you're responsible about it. You will take care of your bike. You will make sure that you don't ride around it in breakneck speeds and harm yourself. There are certain guidelines. Here are the guidelines. This is the time you can ride your bike. This is the time you can't ride your bike. Also, in return, sometimes we turn around and say, all right, I'll get you the bike, but you need to commit to your studies first as well. You must do some household work as well, or maybe you earn the bike rather than me giving you the bike. That's a dialogue we have as parents and children, right? So again, since you started from there, let me bring that into practical example inside an organization as well, right? So if you are a junior level member who's watching this and you're just starting your careers, please don't wait to be empowered. Please, right? Just get on it and be empowered. Nobody has told you not to be empowered, no? Right? Has anyone told you can't be empowered? No, not at all. You're empowered. So take it and run with it, right? But if you're a manager, if you're someone with a title, right, then you have an added responsibility, which is you have 2 ways of responding to this. If you become the person who kills that spirit, then you're failing in your leadership journey. What you need to be doing is to nourish that and mold that into being something productive rather than counterproductive. Because this whole energetic, gung-ho kind of attitude can be very counterproductive also. Don't forget that, right? And sometimes they say, no, you can give enough people enough rope and they will hang themselves. And that is true. People can harm themselves with good intention, of course, but they can still harm themselves. And that is why we as parents will watch out for our children, not to control them, but to turn around and give a little warning signal to say, hey, watch it. If your son was 5 years old and he was in the second floor balcony pretending to be Batman and wanted to jump out, you're not going to tell him, jump, let's find out what happens, right? You'll be mad to do that, right? That's why you're a parent. You will turn it around and say, don't, I know what's going to happen. And you will explain this, but later on they will find out. And you might turn around and say, you know what, if you really want to jump, I'll give you a 1-foot box. Jump off at that and see what happens. And if you hurt yourself, imagine what you will do there. That is your role. Now, if you stop him all the time, chances are when you're not looking, he might jump. Which is the same thing that happens inside organizations as well. So if you say no, without explaining the why, that is what happens. You're bound to find trouble, right? So, encapsulating that, what are you supposed to do to empower people? From the perspective of the person who's waiting to be empowered, don't wait to be empowered. Take it and run with it, right? And the best way to do that is to volunteer for something. You like something that you want to do, go and ask for it. What is stopping you from asking for it? There's a project, go and ask, can I lead this? I really like this. Can I do this? There's nothing stopping you. The worst that can happen is somebody can say no. Then fine. Then find a different way of asking the same question, right? But if you're a leader, if you're a manager, and if you're taking on that role, then please do make sure that you don't kill that spirit and that you're able to quietly mold that person along that so that his empowerment doesn't harm him. As long as you're not allowing that to happen, you're fine. Safra asks a question, right?
Safra has a question, Vidusha. What if you constantly take responsibility, but you don't see a change in the person?
Right. I have a short answer to that as well as a pointed one, right? Then you're failing as a leader. That's what it is.
Right? I think it's not you. Thanks for the question, Safra.
No, it is, right? So that's what I'm saying. It's ultimately taking responsibility is an all-inclusive thing. There's a lovely quotation in the army to say that there are no bad soldiers, there are only bad generals. Okay, there are no bad soldiers, there are only bad generals, and that is true.
Right.
Okay, so as a parent, if what we are doing isn't changing our sons or daughters' behaviors, who's at fault? Right? As a parent, we are. That's the job. So my answer is honestly, and I mean this purposefully, right? I'm conscious of time, but I will take this up quietly later if you have a little bit more time. But I'll let you answer that question, ask another question. But the answer to this is, if you're constantly taking responsibility, but you don't see a change in the person, you need to change tactics. You need to change the way you approach it. And you need to find sometimes alternatives. And here's a good one, right? You don't have to do this all by yourself. Even in parenting, that's why we have parents, right? And we have an extended family also. We have grandparents involved, aunts and uncles involved, nephews and nieces involved. It really does take an entire village to bring up a child, right? So if what you're doing isn't necessarily bringing the results, ask for help from somebody else. Because it is important to change this mindset and to change that person. So you have a colleague of yours working with you, ask him for help. Maybe that person's intervention that might work better. Again, it's not about you. The objective, always work with the objective in mind, the end in mind. What is the end objective? Making sure that that person succeeds, making sure that the person is better. And if what you're doing is not cutting it, ask someone else to help. And if that person intervenes and that changes, fantastic, no problems. You're not in it for the credit. So this is like when the son gets good marks, right? Then it's my son. When the son gets bad marks, it's your son.
Yeah. Yes.
I hope I answered
that's not leadership.
No, it isn't. That's passing the buck.
Hope so. Safra, I think you're happy with it. Thanks for the question. I think that help us to touch base on that perspective. That's an interesting comment. I just want to display it in the screen, Vidusha. Right, have a
No, no,
look at
it
it.
was a wonderful one.
Of course, I mean yes,
But a
right.
lovely
So
comment
we
as
are
well.
talking about it.
Great
I
masters
think
out there.
Vidusha, you want to just
People
touch
are
base on this.
human.
That's where the challenge is also, right? That's where the challenge is also, right? Because we are human, right? If we are
Absolutely.
robots, if we tell something to people, they will do as it is, as commanded, like software program be done. It just has to follow the instruction. That's it, right? And everything else that matters is being under control. So you have everything clear. That's where the
Absolutely.
leadership becomes a challenge.
And bosses are always at the
Right.
end of things, right? My boss is like this, my boss is like that, and so on and so forth. And I always tell people, please understand that they're human too, right? You don't want to risk certain things, right? Imagine if I told you to risk something and you shy away from risking it. Your boss is about the same. We are all fallible human beings. We're not enlightened souls or angels or whatever. We're just fallible human beings. But the important thing, like I said, is to go back to basics and understand what you're in this for. And there are human beings and there are good human beings, and also there are astute human beings, right? There comes in different forms, and ours is a journey that we personally undertake for us to better ourselves. But the moment you take on a leadership journey, your job is to make sure that people around you are doing better than what they were doing yesterday in every aspect of the word. And if you've done that, then you're on the right track. But if people around you are suffering because of you, well, then you need to change yourself before you ask anyone else to change.
How to deal with people who are claiming leaders, but they are actually wolf in sheep clothing.
Yep.
Few self-claimed leaders expect the juniors to do their job to get their promotion. How to deal with such people in the long run? Looks like a corporate mess he's thinking of. How to find a right leader to grow rather than suffer? Any suggestions?
Fantastic. Okay. Good question. And I'll answer this in, I am conscious of time, but I'll try and get pointed on this, right? Here's the
Sure.
thing. First of all, there are three parts to this, no? So let me answer all things. How do you deal with leaders who are claiming to be leaders? And that's this. You've answered your question in the question itself. Okay. A leader will never claim himself to be a leader. Others call him a leader. The problem is that we have self-appointed leaders, right? In a
We call
democracy,
ourselves leaders.
yeah, exactly. That's the problem, right? So stop doing that. And the
That's a
moment you have
problem.
someone
That's a
who goes around
problem.
and says, I am a great leader, then you know it's a bogus claim in the first place. Even in a country as a democracy, you appoint a leader, right? You don't have someone waking up in the morning and turning around and saying, you know what, I think I can lead the country, so I'm the leader now. Doesn't work that way. So inside an organization, Niroshan just put the question back in. I'll answer all three of them, just to kind of make sure that I'm on
Sure.
track. So some are actually wolf in sheep clothing. I completely agree. Some in fact many are. If you're self-proclaimed, it's a good starting point to say that chances are you're not what you claim to be. Others should see it that way. I can't turn around and say I'm a good parent. I can't turn around and say I'm a good husband. My wife should say that. My children should say that, isn't it? What's the point in me turning around and saying I'm a great dad? What nonsense, So it's not for us to judge, it's for others to judge. Now, the second part is a very interesting one, JP, because I have a very different take on this. When you have a senior who wants juniors to do their job in order for them to get promoted, I will tell you honestly, use this as a learning opportunity for you. It's not a bad thing. I know that he gets all the glory and the credit and he will get promoted and you will get left behind eventually. That's fine. Don't worry about it, right? But people like this gives you opportunities that others might not necessarily. Okay? Let me give you an example of this. Now, if you have a boss who doesn't want to do anything and wants to get all of your ideas so that he propels himself forward, this is a fantastic opportunity for you to check out whether your ideas work in the first place, right? He's giving you that chance. He wants you to do it because he thinks Through you, he might be able to propel himself. Fantastic, take it. Now, when you do it, you'll realize whether your hypothesis that you had as an idea, whether it actually works or not, because it might not work. What happens then? Right? Not all of our great ideas work. And you and I both know this, Niro, right? I mean, we've done so many things that has completely and utterly failed, right? And that's fine. So imagine a boss who turns around and says, they want to get the promotion. How, I want you to do all of this, and I will give you full permission to do it, because I know if you succeed, I get all the credit. Brilliant. Take that opportunity and make sure that you truly test yourself in that process. You learn a hell of a lot through it. Never miss an opportunity like this. Don't worry about the credit. It's amazing how much you can learn when you don't worry about the credit. Now, at some point, your boss might wisen up to say, hey, you know what? This guy is a really good asset for me to have. Or he might abuse you. Now, here's the great part about it, right? If you have done all of that work, and if you have really grown because of it, you will eventually get headhunted anyway. You will eventually get spotted by somebody else anyway. The organization is not that dumb as you think it is not to notice it, right? So you learn, and if nobody even saw it, at least the next place that you go to, you can always leave your job and get somewhere else. The world's our oyster right now, right? There are plenty of opportunities. But imagine the amount of skills and competencies you would have learned along the way because of it. And finally, how do you find the right leader to grow rather than suffer from? I always tell people there are 3 or 4 things you need to watch out for. The first is find someone whom you can really learn from. He might be a real awful person to work with, but that's okay. If he's technically sound, if he's brilliant at what he does, suffer through him even, it's okay, but learn as much as you can. Sometimes the nicest people aren't the most technically competent, right? Sometimes they are, but I'm saying is sometimes they might not be. But if you find a technically really good, competent person, my advice to you is, even if you have to suffer through it, because you can learn a hell of a lot from them. The second point is, there are some people who are really nice, and you can learn a lot from them too. What do you learn from them? It is to be nice to people. It's about the values that you need to have. It's about how you deal with people, the emotional intelligence part, and all of that. Sometimes you get really lucky to find both of this in the same person. Then you're blessed, right? Then you really are blessed as a subordinate. The fourth variety is this. They might not be nice. They might not be technically competent either. However, they might be really well networked. Now, making sure that you work with them enables you to explore a network which might not be possible with the other 3. So these are the types of bosses you must seek out. How do you know which is which? Very simple. Talk to the people that they work with, and you will be able to suss that out. So depending on which area or which level in your career you're at, or what crossroad you're at in your career, you need to find the right boss. When you're starting out, don't worry about whether you like them or not. Worry about what you can learn from them. When you come to a midpoint, you need to find people who can groom you and coach you in the people management side of things. When you come to a relatively senior position, you need to grow your networks. And that's what will help you leapfrog the next level. So at different stages of your life, in your working life, you need to find the different types of leaders that can help you. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, Vidusha. Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. JP, I think you're happy with the answer. If you have further questions, leading questions to that, do drop them. We will take them. It's a great question as well. Thanks for proactively getting involved here. So Vidusha, few more minutes. The next 2 things that I definitely need to get your insights on these 2 things. So thanks for accepting the next few minutes.
No problem.
The next jargon that I want to tackle, at least at a high level, is change management, right? So let me bring this comment. Now, the question to you is this. Change is inevitable. It's something that companies cannot avoid. Yourself, you can't avoid changes happening around you. The only way possible, only way forward is embracing, to the uncertainty, right? Look at the COVID crisis, right? We never believed that will hit, right? the countries, some countries never heard of such disaster, right? But that hit them. When such disasters in one side hit us, also other priority changes, various other changes that happens around us, we need to have a kind of a clear mindset first. Second, a clear approach to base our work on. So my question to you is, what is your, out of everything that you have gone through, what is your recommended approach for embracing change, managing change?
Sure. Here's the thing, right? I honestly think, once again, that 9 times out of 10, we look at this from the, I mean, there are, of course, two aspects to it. I'm answering it from an organizational perspective because you asked it from an organizational perspective, right? It's slightly different when it comes to an individual. See,
Yep.
we as organizations need to inbuild into our ecosystem. We started with ecosystems now, so I'm going to go there again. We need to build into our ecosystems two aspects which are critical. The first is that we must always have people in a heightened state of readiness. And the best example I can give you is an army, right? Now, an army is prepared to respond at moment's notice, correct? That's what it is now. Now,
Yeah.
it might be peacetime. It might be peacetime. We might have 100 years of peace, right? Singapore has never had an invasion taking place or an internal terrorist threat or anything like that, right? But that doesn't mean the army is sitting down there having coffee on a daily basis and not worrying about their drills, right? The army is always in a state of readiness. Should a situation arise, they respond. Correct? They will respond fast. They will respond in force. They will respond to the best of their ability. And there's an entire process around that. And the closest we have inside an organization for this is a fire drill. Now, fire drill also most people can do as a tick box exercise if you want to. But the fire drill, at least we do on a regular basis, even as a tick box exercise. What is the one other thing we do on a regular basis to prepare people to instantly respond to a calamity of any kind? We don't have it. We talk about disaster preparedness, we talk about importance of change, but people can't respond like that. We freeze. Most normal human beings freeze when situations take place, right? So just give me one second. Yeah. So imagine if you just freeze and you can't respond, how will you react? Right? You must be trained to react. So that's one thing that the organization must build into their ecosystem, right? You must be trained to react. The second part is to make sure that you have procedural support, system support, and policy support in order to respond to a major crisis also. And this is where things like what if scenarios come into play. You need to have, as part of your strategic planning process, if you have that, I call them adaptive plans now, because strategic planning, I think, needs to evolve as well. You need to have an adaptive plan. You need to have scenarios built in. And if you have those scenarios built in and you have your organization in a heightened state of readiness at all times, where people know in case something like this happens, this is what happens. You're trained to react to a situation at moment's notice as individual, then you're fine. Because you can't prepare for this. Today it might be COVID, tomorrow it might be something else, next day it might be a financial crisis, next year it can be, a natural disaster. It can be anything. You can't look at all the things that can go wrong in the world and try and put systems in place for that. But you can train people to have a state of readiness. So in your ecosystem, you need to have both of those, the policy procedural system aspect of it and the people's readiness part of it built in. And that's a critical HR function to perform. If you can do that, I think you will manage change perfectly well.
Excellent, Vidusha. Thank you. I think that's all what I would like to talk about here. Just to wrap up the discussion, I think it's a very broad topic that we can talk for hours and hours. Still, we will not finish it, right? But due to the time constraint here, we'd like to conclude that the discussion here.
Sure.
So, as the final message, right? I would like to hear from you. If you sum up the whole 1 hour and 10 minutes discussion, also if you think of your leadership perspective, Vidusha, what is your final message for the ones who are watching us in terms of leadership? If you want to sum up your message, this is about the leadership, this is the message that I have for you, what is that going to be?
You want it from an individual perspective? As an individual?
Yeah, that is fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Focus on individual perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what I think, Niroshan, right? I genuinely think one of the things that that really touched me long years ago was the fact that we try and blow these things up, right? We make them into fads, we make it into marketing things, we make this into being about self-promotion, all of that. Okay. And we sometimes forget the most simplest of things. So my message, honestly, to anyone who's watching in, if you really want to take on a leadership journey, because that's what it is, it's a journey of self-discovery, if you want to call it that, right? Is if you're genuine about this, okay? If you're genuine about this, if you want to succeed in your career because of it, then it's a whole different conversation. I'll have a different take.
Yeah.
But if you really want to truly grow as a person, right? My 3 pieces of advice to you would be, first of all, don't forget the limelight out of it. Lots of people make the horrible mistake of focusing on the limelight, and that'll come. That'll come. If you're doing a good job, I genuinely feel it'll always come, right? It's just that it'll take a little longer for you than others, but that's okay. By that time, you'll be ready. And the chance of you making fundamental mistakes will also not be there then, because you're totally ready, right? So don't hug the limelight. The second is be genuinely willing to help.
Right.
It's a very simple thing. Be willing to help someone else. If you can help someone on a regular basis, I think you've started that journey and that process, right? Help. So don't worry about the credit. Always seek out and help. And the third thing is, which is really important, which is introspect. And think about what you have done and not done at the end of your day. Introspect. And that's really important, because most of the time we just go through a day and we never think about it. And we don't have time to think, right? Sometimes people turn around and say, I don't have time to think. That's the problem.
We are too busy to look back, right? We are too busy to look back. So we just go on. Right? Just go on.
So at the end of every day, and I promise you, this might sound like a very kiddish thing to do, but I promise you it isn't. And it's something I honestly do. At the end of every day, just sit down, take a piece of paper or a book or whatever it might be, and write down what you think you did well. And I don't mean achievements and stuff. Huh? I'm talking of simple behaviors, what you did right or what you did well, and also at least find one thing that you wish you didn't do. And see how many times you will repeat this. Now, if you write this down on a daily basis, at the end of every week, you will find out that there are certain patterns, and you're raising it to the level of consciousness then. I remember when I first started speaking arrangements, right? I used to have, you and I both know this, because, you speak, I speak. And when in our normative years, we make horrible mistakes sometimes. And I used to have certain filler words that would come in. And it's fine to have filler words. That's perfectly fine. I'm not talking of, being an excellent speaker or anything like that. I'm just saying, raise it to the level of consciousness. And one of the things I got a couple of my friends to do was to give me that feedback whenever I spoke at office. And one of the things they told me is that I crack dirty jokes. And this came up a few times over. Now, I was 24, 25 years old, and I didn't think much of it. But it was very, very good feedback. And I did think about it. And I do remember in about a week's period, I got this feedback over 15 times, 20 times. And I thought about it, and I asked my friends, do I really crack that many dirty jokes? And they turned around and said, yes, dude, you always do. It's one of the things you do all the time. And thank God I stopped it, because it can be very distasteful to some. You cracking a dirty joke with your friends is one thing. Doing that in public is another, right? So always introspect and ask yourself, are there a few things that I shouldn't be doing? And start with your family first. Every week, ask your kids, do you see something in me that you think I should change? And that's a good place to start, because kids are born honest. If you ask the question, they will give you answers, right? Try doing this, and I think you'll be fine.
Excellent. I love the whole discussion. The wisdom you shared, it's your own experience and also your perspectives. But I think a lot of things that you spoke about will definitely add value to us, value to the people who watched us and will be watching us. So
Thank you.
Again, it's a privilege to have this discussion with you, Vidusha.
Thank you
My
very much.
sincere thanks to you accepting my invite and volunteering to spend your 1 hour.
See you soon.
All right. Cool. Thanks a lot, Vidusha. Yep.
Thank you.